Elijah Cain had ridden the high plains so long that even the coyotes seemed to know his name, a man carved out of silence and solitude, a shadow against the blazing horizon whose life was marked by long nights under the cold stars and days where the wind carried nothing but dust and the mournful cries of hawks circling over some dying thing. He had once been more than a drifter, once the son of a rancher with land enough to make a man proud, once a brother, once a husband, but all those bonds had been stripped away by bullets, fire, and the cruel hand of fate, leaving him hollowed out and wandering with only his horse, Bramble, and a rifle that had grown as familiar to him as his own skin. And so when he crested the ridge and looked down at the canyon town of Ash Creek, smoke rising from its chimneys, the metallic clang of a blacksmith echoing even up to the high rock, he thought of nothing but a meal, maybe whiskey if luck was kind, and a bed where he could rest his weary bones. But the West had a way of setting traps for a man's heart when he least expected it, and as Elijah rode slowly down the main street, the boards creaking under Bramble's hooves, eyes turned to him with that wary suspicion reserved for strangers. Yet it was not their stares that caught his soul, it was the gallows that stood at the far end of the street, a stark wooden frame casting a long shadow in the midday sun, and swaying from that rope was the figure of a young woman, her dress torn and dirt-stained, her hair, a tangle of dark strands that caught flashes of gold where the light struck, falling across a face too pale for life, too delicate for such an ending. Elijah felt something cold grip him, something deeper than pity, and though the townsfolk had already started to drift away, murmuring among themselves of justice served and crimes punished, he did not move on. He did not ignore her as he had ignored 1,000 bodies on 1,000 trails, for there was something in the shape of her, in the cruel stillness of her hanging form, that reached into the hollow place inside him where memory and pain had lived alone for so many years. And before he knew what he was doing, his boots hit the ground, his knife was in his hand, and with a defiant slice he cut the rope, catching her limp body against his chest as though she were no heavier than a sack of feathers. And then the world seemed to pause, for in that moment, in the dusty silence broken only by the whisper of the wind, her lips parted, a faint tremor shuddered through her chest, and a thin breath, fragile as a newborn's cry, escaped from her throat. And Elijah Cain, who had lived without hope or purpose for near a decade, found himself staring down at a girl who had just cheated death in his arms, a girl the town had already condemned, and with that single breath the course of his life bent toward a storm he could neither foresee nor escape. The murmur of the crowd had shifted, shock rippling like a wind through wheat as men and women who had witnessed the hanging now turned back, their eyes wide with disbelief, some whispering curses, others muttering about the devil's work. And the sheriff, a broad-shouldered man with a gray beard and a star pinned to his chest, pushed through them with a scowl, his spurs clinking sharply as he came up to where Elijah knelt with the girl in his arms. And his voice was iron when he spoke, saying, "Stranger, you best let her go, justice has already been done here." But Elijah, who had faced down death in more forms than most men could imagine, did not flinch under the lawman's stare. He pulled the girl closer, felt the faint flutter of her pulse against his wrist, and said in a voice that carried low but firm, "Justice don't leave a woman breathing, Sheriff, she ain't gone yet, and I won't hand her over to die again." And the sheriff's jaw tightened as the townsfolk muttered louder, their voices a rising storm of fear, anger, and awe, for in the Wild West, where superstition ran as deep as blood, a girl who survived the noose was a sign, an omen, something half in this world and half in the next. And Elijah knew in his bones that whether they called her witch, sinner, or saint, the town would not easily let her live. So with a sharp whistle to Bramble, he swung her up into the saddle, her fragile frame draped before him, and with a tug on the reins he spurred the horse down the street, gunshots ringing out behind him as men raised rifles and pistols. But Bramble was faster than fear, hooves pounding like thunder as Elijah and the girl fled the gallows of Ash Creek into the open wilderness beyond. The ride was a blur of wind and dust. Elijah's arms braced around the girl to keep her steady as Bramble carried them hard across the plains, each breath she took shallow and ragged, her weight slumping heavier against him as though she were caught between this world and the next. And with every mile Elijah's thoughts twisted with questions. Who was she? What crime had she been accused of? Why did fate see fit to place her in his path when he had sworn never again to care for a soul? But the answers could wait, for survival pressed on him with the urgency of a rattlesnake's strike. They would not ride all night, not with her in such a state, so when the sun bled itself out against the horizon, he turned Bramble toward a line of cottonwoods by a creek, a place half hidden where water whispered and the grass grew thick enough to bed down, and there he slid from the saddle, cradling her as gently as he might a child, laying her on a patch of soft earth by the water's edge. Her face was pale but not lifeless, her lips trembling faintly as though words struggled to break free, and Elijah, whose hands had once been skilled at tending wounds before war and grief had hardened them into weapons, found himself unbuckling his saddlebag, drawing out his canteen, his old kit of herbs and bandages kept more out of habit than hope, and working with a care he thought long dead in him, he poured cool water to her lips, bathed her throat where the rope had burned cruel rings into her skin, and listened as her breathing, though fragile, grew steadier in the hush of night. Stars wheeled overhead, 1,000 cold fires in the velvet dark, and Elijah sat by the creek with his rifle across his knees, watching the girl as she lay wrapped in his coat, her chest rising and falling in a rhythm that anchored him more than he wanted to admit, and though he did not know her name or her story, though danger surely rode hard behind them from Ash Creek, he felt something stirring within himself, something he had buried deep beneath years of dust and sorrow, the dangerous spark of connection, the perilous weight of purpose, the whisper of a destiny tied not to land or gold or vengeance, but to a stranger who had breathed back life in his arms after the hangman's noose had claimed her, and as the coyotes howled in the distance and the night wind rustled through the trees, Elijah Kane, the lone cowboy who had walked the earth as if already dead, understood that his solitude had ended, and that every choice from this moment forward would be bound to the fragile life of the girl who refused to die.